you write in your book about how you look at some of these issues through a perspective of an older feminist lens that is not afraid to look at sex as political. In terms of feminist theory, when did that shift happen? When sex was viewed, at least in mainstream feminist theory, as outside of the political sphere? Because you would think that, feminist thinkers, and I know there's a range of them if you're intersectional or if you're a white feminist, right? And the latter of which I'm quite critical of on this program. You would think that would still be at the forefront, but what is the history of that? How did that kind of get obscured?
So I'll stick to the American case because I think it's what your viewers will be most familiar with, and it's a really good test case for this. So, in the late 60s and 1970s, as the women's liberation movement is taking place in the US, you have this repoliticization of all sorts of things that have been understood previously to just be private: sex, abortion, contraception, the structure of the family, childcare, healthcare, education. And then what starts happening, however, for really good reason, is that by the time we get to the 90s, there's a kind of pushback against thinking of at least some aspects of sex as political. And people increasingly want to say, feminists increasingly want to say, no, look, you shouldn't actually subject the kind of sex people are having to political critique, so long as it's consensual, right? And so the kind of critique that earlier feminists wanted to offer, what they would say, look at the kind of sex that people are having. This isn't genuinely free sex. This is sex that's actually shaped by patriarchal expectations, according to which men are going to be in every way dominant and women are there to submissively serve men's pleasure. That's itself a political construct. Feminists increasingly in the 80s and 90s wanted to back away from that and wanted just to insist that, no, actually, as long as it's consensual, it's fine. Now, as I said, that's for some good reasons, right? There are dangers in subjecting sex to a kind of political critique and telling people that they shouldn't be having certain forms of sex, even if they're consensual, right? That's what conservatives do all of the time, right? They tell people they shouldn't be having consensual gay sex, or they shouldn't be having consensual non-normative sex, or consensual sex outside of the family or outside of marriage. And so some feminists started to feel that this kind of anti-sex feminism was authoritarian, right? It was trying to control women in kind of the same way that men had historically controlled women. So there was a kind of backlash against it. And we got the embrace of what's called sex positivity, right? A form of feminism that is supposed to be actively embracing all sorts of different forms of sex as long as they are consensual. But one of the things that I think has happened, and you can really see this by talking to like young women now, college-age women, high school-age women, is that sex positivity, which was supposed to be a liberating doctrine, has ended up making a lot of women feel pressured to just have a lot of sex on men's terms. So it ends up not really feeling freeing to them. So there's a kind of complicated dialectic here, but what you see is throughout this history, women trying to articulate what sexual freedom really means or might really involve. And what would it mean to have sex outside of a script that's just written by men?
So is part of that too just if feminist theory or sex positivity, I should say, and that concept, if it excludes itself from politics to that degree, or you're just, all sex is, if it's consensual, it's fine, right? And you make a kind of broad strokes argument about that. One, I think it obviously needs to be updated to include trans people, include non-binary people, etc. But two, you're kind of ceding the sexual political space to the right, and when you cede territory to them, they seize everything that they can, right? And you exit the political space to a degree. They fill that vacuum very easily. They're a minoritarian ideology, honestly, as particularly in the United States, and that's kind of inherent to how they seize power right now. So is that part of the fear as well?
That's such an interesting analysis. And to me, it makes really good sense of the incel phenomenon. And which I do
I
talk
want to
about a
get
little
into
bit.
that too.
Which I talk
Yeah.
about, yeah.
Right.
So because I think what you're saying is right. So you have on one hand a kind of mainstream left understanding of sex where as long as it's consensual, it's fine. So basically it's a market ideology, right? So long as Amazon worker has contracted to be screwed over in the warehouse, then what Jeff Bezos is doing is permissible. And so you have a similar kind of market logic within sex. As long as it's consensual, it's fine. Intuitively, a lot of people chafe at this, right? Because you look at what actually happens in sex and you think, but there are weird hierarchies here. For example, there are racial hierarchies that say that people of certain races are more sexually desirable or have higher sexual status than other people. And I think one thing, and what happens is that there's a right-wing narrative that very easily steps into that gap. You see it from someone like Jordan Peterson,
Mm-hmm.
who offers you offers a young, dissatisfied sort of man, typically a diagnosis, right? And it's always a return to a mythical, traditional time when everyone was sexually satisfied because we had marriage, and that meant that no man had to go without sexually. Of course, whether this served women or not is kind of beside the point. But I think you're right that it's a sort of failure of the left, because actually feminists are well positioned in a sense to speak to incels, at least before they've gone totally radicalized. Because feminists can say to incels, you're right that a lot of the ways that the sexual marketplace works, the fact that it is a marketplace and it's seen as a place of trading status, that's messed up. That's not a really sexually free realm. But the ideology you're being pulled towards by someone like Peterson is the equivalent of, a member of the so-called traditional white working class, blaming immigrants or people of color for their objectively immiserated situation, rather than identifying the true culprit, which is, the capitalist oppressor, to put it, bluntly.
That's an incredible argument. I mean, the extrapolation of neoliberal ideology onto like sexuality, I've never ever thought of it that way. But they're mirroring alienation.
Mm-hmm.
That's mirroring that kind of alienation that's driving people towards, as you say, demonizing ethnic groups on the political stage, but in terms of the incel community, demonizing women and looking for outside sources and groups for feelings of loss or listlessness or inability to connect in a society that makes it very hostile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in both cases, what you also have is, on one hand, a kind of justified grievance at real phenomena, and then an unjustified grievance at the perception of a thwarted entitlement, right? So there's, on one hand, members of the so-called traditional white working class have very strong reason to be angry in the US about just the state of economic inequality, right? But they incorrectly think that what is happening is that racial minorities are doing better than they are, which objectively is just false, right? And there's something similar going on, I think, in the case of incels. They have a kind of justified grievance about this sexuality and sex treated as this kind of status conferring commodity, but what they're really upset about is the fact that they're not getting what they think that they're entitled to, rather than offering a fundamental critique of the entire system.
100%.